Yeah, well, but I liked you right away
Did
when
he tell you that I had said that you should?
that we should make out?
Well, no, it was after that. I just looked.
In 1982, Warren Beatty accepted his only competitive Oscar for directing Reds and delivered a message almost nobody in the room understood. He never said her name, but one woman watching knew exactly what he meant. She wasn't his date, wasn't in the building, and hadn't been part of his life for years. Beatty had been linked to some of the 20th century's most famous women, yet married only once. For decades, tabloids chased the loudest romances and largely missed the real story. The evidence points elsewhere, to the woman behind a tribute hidden inside Beatty's greatest Hollywood triumph. The speech nobody outside Hollywood understood. The scene was the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, spring of 1982. Warren Beatty had just won Best Director for Reds, a 3-hour epic about a communist journalist that had taken him the better part of a decade to get made, fighting studios the entire way for the money and the time to finish it his way. Reds had been nominated for 12 Oscars that night, an enormous haul for a film about the Russian Revolution that most executives had assumed would flop the moment it was pitched. A film built almost entirely on the strength of Beatty's own stubbornness and reputation. Beatty himself had pulled off something only he and Orson Welles had ever managed, earning nominations in all 4 major categories: acting, directing, writing, and producing for a single film. And he'd already done it once before with Heaven Can Wait in 1978, a feat that alone would have secured his place in Hollywood history, even without everything that came after. Standing at the microphone, he thanked the usual list of collaborators, the cast, the crew, the studio executives who'd finally let him make the film his own way. Then he did something people close to him immediately recognized, and most of the audience didn't. He referenced a woman who wasn't his date, wasn't his co-star, and wasn't even at the ceremony. Diane Keaton had played the female lead in Reds, and their real-life relationship had been falling apart for most of the shoot, strained by exactly how consuming the project had become for him. The public assumed any dedication that night belonged to her. It didn't. The role of Louise Bryant, the one that won Keaton her own Oscar nomination, had originally been written for someone else entirely. Beatty had planned for years to give that part to a different actress, one he'd been picturing in the role since he first started researching the story back in the late 1960s. She turned it down. By the time cameras rolled, she and Beatty hadn't been a couple in years. He gave the role to Keaton instead, and dedicated the finished film to the woman who said no. To understand why a 2-time Oscar winner would spend his biggest career triumph honoring an ex-girlfriend who wasn't even part of the movie, you have to go back to a Virginia childhood that gave almost no hint of what was coming. The quiet kid who studied Al Jolson in the corner of the room. Warren Beatty was born Henry Warren Beatty on March 30th, 1937, in Richmond, Virginia, into a Baptist household built on order and routine, the kind of tight-knit family structure that left little visible room for the wandering romantic life he'd eventually become famous for. His mother, Kathleen, taught drama and directed school plays, filling the house with rehearsals and half-memorized lines, her energy around theater leaving a quiet imprint on her son long before he ever considered acting as a career. His father, Ira, was a psychologist and educator, methodical where his wife was theatrical, moving the family between Richmond, Norfolk, and eventually Arlington for work. His older sister watched all of this too, and went on to become one of the biggest names in Hollywood herself, working under a different name, Shirley MacLaine, already appearing in an Alfred Hitchcock film by the time Warren was still a teenager, figuring out what he wanted. Warren wasn't the performer in the family growing up. He was the quiet one who sat in corners doing impressions of Milton Berle and Al Jolson for nobody in particular, building characters with no audience at all, an oddly private habit for a boy who'd spend the rest of his life surrounded by cameras. A re-release of the Philadelphia story in 1950 struck something in him too. A signal rather than just an afternoon at the movies. The first real sense that performing might be more than a private habit. At Washington Lee High School in Arlington, he became the star quarterback and class president, fielding 10 football scholarship offers before turning every single one of them down. His sister's spotlight on Broadway had already gotten under his skin. He wanted something less certain than a football career, and in 1954, he enrolled at Northwestern University instead, joining a fraternity and studying liberal arts. It didn't last. He dropped out after 1 year, followed the pull toward acting to Stella Adler's studio in New York, and started surviving on peanut butter sandwiches, dishwashing shifts, and work as a sandhog in Manhattan's tunnels, taking whatever paid the rent between auditions. His early career built fast once it actually started. He debuted on live television in the Miracle Workers rehearsal circuit for Studio One, appearing in a broadcast called The Night America Trembled in September of 1957. A small background role on a show that had already launched names like James Dean and Grace Kelly before him. Kraft Television Theater and Playhouse 90 followed, along with a recurring spot on The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis by 1959. None of those credits were glamorous. All of them were muscle memory, teaching him rhythm and pacing the same way his summer stock work at Washington's National Theater had taught him the mechanics of a live stage. In 1958, he took a role in a Broadway production called A Loss of Roses. The play folded quickly, but his performance was strong enough to catch a director's attention and put him on a path that would define the rest of his life. That early hustle mattered because it shaped exactly the kind of actor and later producer he became. Someone who trusted his own instincts over anyone else's, even when it cost him relationships on set. He fought Elia Kazan for rewrites during his very first film. He'd go on to fire a director midway through a 1974 political thriller called The Parallax View and finish the film himself, delayed release and all, driven by his own anger over Watergate and a need for total creative control that never really faded as his career grew. Colleagues who worked with him across 5 decades used strikingly similar language to describe him: brilliant, magnetic, and genuinely difficult to actually finish a production with. That same stubborn insistence on doing things his own way is exactly why, when he finally got the chance to make his most personal film years later, he refused every shortcut, including the easy option of simply moving on from a relationship that had ended more than a decade earlier. The engagement that ended before the wedding. Splendor in the Grass hit theaters in 1961, Beatty's film debut, opposite Natalie Wood. He played a troubled teenager in 1920s Kansas, fought director Elia Kazan for rewrites and extra takes, and got labeled controlling by some critics and fearless by others, a pattern of demanding creative input that would follow him through the rest of his career. Off-camera, something more complicated was happening. He and Wood grew close during filming, close enough that word reached his fiancée, Joan Collins, back in Los Angeles, who'd been engaged to Beatty since they'd met a couple of years earlier on the Roman spring of Mrs. Stone. The engagement didn't survive it. Collins and Beatty had been together for roughly 2 years, and by most accounts of the era, his wandering attention during Splendor in the Grass was the beginning of the end of that relationship, one that had already been strained by his habit of drifting toward whoever he was working closely with at the time. Wood, married to Robert Wagner at the time, found herself at the center of a relationship that blew up 2 other people's lives before it even had a name of its own. A messy, overlapping tangle that Hollywood gossip columns fed on for months, printing every rumor with barely a second thought about who it might hurt. It set a pattern that would follow Beatty through the next decade: talented, driven, magnetic on screen, and consistently unable to stay inside the lines of whatever relationship he was already in when the next one started. That pattern was about to collide with the one woman biographers and friends alike would later single out as different from all the rest, the woman he was supposed to marry. In 1967, in between all of it, Beatty produced and starred in Bonnie and Clyde, a film the studio itself doubted so much that they gave him 40% of the gross instead of a fixed salary. Assuming there wouldn't be much gross to split, they were wrong. The film cost roughly $2.5 million to make and pulled in over $70 million worldwide, becoming one of the most profitable movies of its era, and turning Beatty from a promising leading man into one of the most powerful people in Hollywood almost overnight. Its violent, French New Wave-inspired ending, stitched together from dozens of quick cuts, shattered the old studio system's rules about what a mainstream American film was allowed to show, and it earned Beatty his first Oscar nomination in the process. That kind of power meant he could suddenly write his own rules, choose his own projects, and keep almost anyone he wanted close to him, on set and off it. It's the exact leverage that let him spend the next 15 years chasing one specific film idea until it was finally ready, and one specific woman kept reappearing at the center of it the entire time. Julie Christie had just won an Oscar for Darling when she and Beatty found each other in the mid-1960s, and what followed was less a romance than a decade-long orbit that neither of them ever quite escaped, even after other people, other films, and other decades came between them. They made 3 films together across the 1970s, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Shampoo, and Heaven Can Wait, a run that earned the two of them 14 Oscar nominations combined and made Christie his single most frequent screen partner of the era. No other actress worked with him that many times during that period. Friends who knew them both said the connection ran deeper than the film sets they shared. One person close to Beatty put it plainly years later. If he hadn't made Bonnie and Clyde, the movie that turned him into a producer and a power player almost overnight, he likely would have married Julie Christie instead of chasing the career that came with staying single and unattached, free to move from project to project without anyone waiting at home for him. In 1969, Christie traveled with Beatty to Russia, a trip that planted the seed for what eventually became Reds. He'd wander the country asking strangers about the revolution, turning over an idea that would take him 13 years to actually finish writing and financing. In one exchange he later recounted, he asked an elderly Russian woman who claimed to have known the real John Reed how she felt about Stalin. And her answer, only hate, but the revolution is still in its early stages, stuck with him for years as exactly the kind of raw, contradictory passion he wanted the finished film to capture. Christie wasn't just his girlfriend during that decade. She was present at the exact moment his most personal project was born, sitting beside him in a country neither of them had any real reason to visit otherwise, watching him fall in love with an idea he wouldn't finish chasing for another 13 years. Neither of them ever pushed hard for marriage. Christie had said publicly more than once that she didn't believe in being tied down to one person, describing herself as someone who needed to stay free rather than settled. Beatty, for his part, called long-term relationships more painful than short ones, an odd thing to say about the woman most people around him assumed he'd eventually settle down with. That assumption turned out to be wrong, but not because the relationship simply faded quietly into the background without a fight. The names that filled the years in between. While Christie remained the through line, she was never the only name attached to Beatty during this stretch. And the list is long enough that even people close to him lost count over the years. He dated actress Leslie Caron, and by her own account, he did what he apparently did with every serious partner. Stayed close after it ended, and reportedly encouraged her towards psychoanalysis during the breakup. An odd but oddly consistent habit of his that friends noted repeated itself with partner after partner. He was linked to Brigitte Bardot, Isabelle Adjani, Raquel Welch, and Bianca Jagger, names that read now like a roll call of the era's most photographed women, each relationship generating its own wave of magazine covers and speculation. He had a widely reported relationship with singer Carly Simon, one serious enough that music historians still debate whether he was the real subject of her 1972 hit about vanity and betrayal, a song that topped the charts while the rumors about its inspiration swirled through the industry for years afterward. Michelle Phillips, formerly of the Mamas and the Papas, dated him during one of his most turbulent professional stretches, and her sudden death in a car accident years later reportedly affected him deeply, a grief he carried quietly into later interviews without ever fully explaining in public. By the mid-1970s, the sheer volume of names attached to Beatty had become its own kind of legend. Entertainment writers, who tried to actually tally his relationships over the decades, landed on estimates in the thousands, a number that says less about any precise count and more about how completely his reputation as Hollywood's most restless bachelor had taken hold of the public imagination. Goldie Hawn's name entered the mix in the 70s too, a relationship covered breathlessly by the tabloids of the era, filled with photographers and speculation. None of it, according to the people who actually knew him, ever fully replaced the pull Christie still had on him. That pull was about to be tested one more time, in the exact years he needed her most. One more name deserves mention here, if only because it's the one most casual fans guess first. In 1990, while directing and starring in Dick Tracy, Beatty cast Madonna as Breathless Mahoney, and the two began a widely publicized relationship during production, one that generated exactly the kind of tabloid frenzy his earlier romances had, complete with paparazzi camped outside every location and gossip columns tracking their every appearance together. It was intense, it was brief, and it burned out well before the decade was over. Unlike Christie, there's no dedicated film, no quietly coded acceptance speech, no friend on record saying he nearly married her instead of pursuing his career. It was, by nearly every account, a passionate distraction rather than the kind of relationship that reshaped how he approached his work. The woman who actually did that was never the famous pop star everyone assumes, and it was never really the Hollywood royalty either. The Keatons and the Hawns and the Wood-era entanglements that filled up decades of magazine covers. It was the quiet British actress who turned down two of the biggest things he ever offered anyone: a role and, according to people who knew them both, a life together. The role she turned down and the film he dedicated anyway. By the time Beatty was finally ready to make Reds in the late 1970s, he and Christie had already broken up, ending their relationship sometime in the mid-1970s without a public scandal or a messy tabloid war to mark the end. It was, by accounts from people close to both of them, a quiet, mutual parting rather than an explosive one, the kind of ending that leaves no headlines behind for anyone to later dig up. But Beatty had never stopped picturing her in the role of Louise Bryant, the journalist at the center of his Russian Revolution epic. He'd been planning it since before the breakup, shaping the character in his head with her voice and her presence long before a single page of the script was finished. When production finally started, years after the two of them had split, he offered her the part anyway. Christie said no. She reportedly felt the role should go to an American actress rather than a British one. A professional judgment rather than a personal snub, the kind of principled stand that had always defined how she approached her work. Beatty gave the part to Diane Keaton instead, and the two of them became a couple during filming. A relationship complicated from the start by exactly how much the project meant to him. Keaton later described it plainly. She adored him, but the movie was the real passion of that period in his life, more than any romance running alongside it. She has said she never really believed the two of them would be remembered as one of the great Hollywood romances, precisely because Reds itself was always the thing he loved most urgently during those years. By the time Reds wrapped, Keaton has said, the two of them weren't really a couple in any meaningful sense anymore, even though the relationship technically continued a while longer after the cameras stopped, drifting rather than ending in any single dramatic moment. Production itself became its own kind of legend. Beatty interviewed more than 100 people across the Soviet Union to get the history right, refused to trim a single minute from the finished film's 3-hour-plus runtime, and shot across 4 countries with a cast that included Jack Nicholson and Maureen Stapleton, the latter of whom reportedly snapped at him after one too many repeated takes during a single scene. He sold his own Beverly Hills home at one point just to keep the production funded when the budget ballooned far past what any studio wanted to keep approving. None of that obsessive commitment was really about John Reed, the communist journalist at the center of the story. Friends who watched him fight for 13 years to make this specific film, funded partly out of his own pocket, understood it was never really a movie about Russia at all. It was a movie about a woman who'd once stood beside him in that country and then walked away. And no amount of Oscar nominations or box office success ever fully talked him out of finishing it exactly the way he'd first imagined it, with her still in the picture. And the more time passed, the harder it became to separate the film from the memory that had started it all. The woman he'd originally imagined in the center of the story was no longer beside him, but the version of her that existed in his memory had already become part of the film itself. He could replace the actress. He could change the cast. He could spend years rebuilding the production around a different reality. What he couldn't seem to replace was the emotional connection to the moment that had inspired the whole thing in the first place. Reds went on to earn roughly $40 million worldwide, one of the biggest earners of 1981, and it lost Best Picture that night to Chariots of Fire, despite its 12 nominations. Beatty didn't seem to mind losing the top prize nearly as much as people expected. He'd already gotten the one win that actually mattered to him personally, the Best Director statue that let him stand at that microphone and say what he needed to say, in the only way he apparently felt comfortable saying it. Then came the Oscars. Beatty won Best Director for a film he'd spent 13 years fighting to make, a film built entirely around a trip to Russia he'd taken with Christie in 1969, more than a decade before the cameras finally rolled. In his acceptance speech, he found a way to acknowledge her, a reference subtle enough that most of the audience missed it entirely, but clear enough that the people who knew their history understood exactly what had just happened in that room. He'd built his life's most personal project around an idea she'd witnessed being born, cast another actress to play the part written with her in mind, and still found a way to give her credit in front of the entire industry watching at home. That's not the behavior of a man honoring a forgotten ex-girlfriend. That's the behavior of a man marking the one relationship he never fully got over, even while it was already a decade in his past, by the time the world finally saw the finished film. The marriage that finally happened, and what he actually said about her. Beatty didn't marry until 1992, at 55 years old, when he met actress Annette Bening on the set of Bugsy, playing real-life gangster Bugsy Siegel opposite her. He proposed within days of shooting starting, a stunning turnaround for a man who'd spent 3 decades avoiding exactly this kind of commitment and had reportedly once called marriage a dead institution in an interview years earlier. Friends who'd watched him cycle through relationship after relationship for 30 years were reportedly stunned at how quickly he settled into the role of husband once Bening entered his life, as though something in him had simply been waiting for the right person to finally stop moving for. The two of them went on to have 4 children, Stephen, Benjamin, Isabel, and Ella, and the marriage has lasted more than 3 decades, by far the longest relationship of his adult life, and longer than every other relationship on this list combined. Benning gave him the home and the roots that decades of headlines suggested he'd never actually wanted. The record, once you actually look at it closely, says otherwise. And that matters when looking back at Christie, because Beatty's eventual marriage didn't erase the significance of what came before it. If anything, it gives the earlier relationship a more complicated place in the story. Christie wasn't the woman he eventually married, and she wasn't the person who built the family he spent the second half of his life protecting. Benning clearly became something different. The lasting partnership, the home, the person with whom he finally chose permanence. But permanence and significance aren't always the same thing. Some relationships become the life you build, while others become the memory you keep returning to when you look back at the person you were before that life existed. And for Beatty, Christie appears to have remained firmly attached to that earlier version of himself. In a 2016 interview, at 79 years old, Beatty was asked directly about the women who'd shaped his life before Benning, part of a wider press tour built around his final film as director. He spoke warmly about nearly all of them, praising Diane Keaton's humor and intelligence without hesitation, calling her a combination of integrity, fairness, and beauty in the same breath, the kind of generous, unguarded answer he gave about almost every other name that came up that afternoon. When the subject turned to Christie specifically, his tone shifted into something quieter and noticeably more careful. He didn't reach for the same easy list of compliments he'd used for everyone else. He described the relationship in exactly 2 words: very respectful. It's a strange, almost clipped answer for a man otherwise happy to talk at length about the brilliant, beautiful women who'd passed through his life. And the restraint itself says something the longer answers never quite managed to. Some things, apparently, still weren't easy for him to talk about even decades later, in front of a reporter with his wife of over 20 years likely reading the finished piece. Maybe that is the most revealing part of the entire story. Beatty had no reason by then to perform heartbreak. There was no career advantage in making Christie sound important, no romantic image left to protect, and no obvious reason to hide behind a vague answer if the relationship truly meant nothing anymore. He was an older man looking back on a life that had already settled into its final shape. He had a wife, children, decades of success behind him, and a history crowded with famous names. Yet when Christie came up, the answer became smaller rather than bigger. 2 words instead of a story. Respect instead of nostalgia. Almost as if saying too much would have required him to explain something he had spent decades allowing the work to say for him. Warren Beatty never stood in front of a camera at 88 and announced a name the way a tabloid headline might promise. He's never needed to. He said it in 1982, in a room full of people who didn't understand what they were hearing, dedicating his most personal film to a woman who'd already turned down the role he wrote for her. And according to the people who knew them both, the marriage he almost offered her years earlier. Everything else lines up around that one moment, the thousands of rumored relationships that never produced a second dedicated film, the one lasting marriage that came only after Christie had long since moved on with her own life and career, and the guarded 2-word answer he gave decades later when a reporter finally asked him directly, face to face, with nowhere left to hide behind a script. Compare that to how easily he talked about Keaton, about Karen, about nearly everyone else who'd passed through his life without a second thought. And the silence around Christie becomes the loudest part of the whole story, the one answer that took him longer to give than any of the others. The love of Warren Beatty's life was never really a mystery. And it was never a secret he was hiding out of shame or scandal the way tabloids love to suggest. It was simply spoken once, quietly, at exactly the right moment, in front of an audience of millions who had no idea what they were watching. He gave Julie Christie the 2 things a man like him almost never gives anyone: a role built entirely around her, and full credit in front of the industry that made him famous. offered up at the exact moment he had the least reason left to still be thinking about her at all. Decades of headlines chasing Madonna, Goldie Hawn, and 1,000 other names never came close to matching that single gesture, made once in 1982, and never really repeated for anyone else who came after her. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.